Our next speaker is Matt McBride. Matt is a longtime friend of FAIR, I guess we'll put it that way, and has spoken before at our conferences. And without much further ado, I'm going to give as much time as I can, so I'm going to turn the time over to Matt McBride.
Okay, it's good to be here. I know some people advise starting your talks with a joke, but as I glance at my notes here, I see that the first two words are Soren and Kierkegaard. So I'm not sure how funny this start's going to be. Nevertheless, Soren Kierkegaard once observed that while life must be lived forward, it can only really be understood backwards. Occasionally, we become conscious of this in our day-to-day experience. So, for example, we might find meaning in a severe trial months or years after it happened that we fail to see in the moment of crisis. Meaning grows from memory. The act of looking back can be a sacred endeavor. Turn your hearts to your fathers, search the scriptures, remember how merciful the Lord has been unto the children of men from the creation of Adam even down to our time. As Latter-day Saints, we're urged repeatedly to gaze back beyond the confines of our own lives and to stand on the shoulders of others, giant or not. The corollary to all this is that someone needed to keep a record in the first place, preserve it, and work to make its insights accessible. Records of the past enlarge our memory. They make sacred remembering possible. Restoration Scripture is replete with commands to record things. Adam's descendants kept a book of remembrance. Nephi keeps records for a wise purpose. The Lord commanded the saints at the first meeting of the church in this dispensation to keep a record. And Joseph Smith and his scribes and associates kept a magnificent record indeed. Well, as the Joseph Smith Papers team, my colleagues and I stand near the end of a 23-year period of sustained remembering, of scrutinizing the record that Joseph kept. We've endeavored to create a complete and open publication of his large plates record, to borrow a phrase from the Book of Mormon. And as we look back on this effort, it's natural to try to take stock, to assess, even to quantify. So here's one attempt. 22 plus years, 1,300 some odd journal entries, 643 letters, 155 revelations, 27 print volumes, 18,822 printed pages, almost 7.5 million words, and nearly 50,000 footnotes. And as some of our team are always anxious to point out, there are also toe notes, which I think we might have invented, I don't know. Exhausting to create, and some would argue that it's exhausting to consume and read. The question that our team is often asked is, can you distill this all down? Where is the meaning in all of these thousands of documents? Who is the Joseph that emerges from an up-close examination of his corpus? In short, they want to know what we've learned from the papers. Well, if you were to ask each of my colleagues this question, they would probably answer it in a completely different way than I would. Each one of them would have their own approach, because this is a historical publication unlike most others. It's not the work of a solitary scholar or the product of a few collaborators. Hundreds of people at this point have now contributed to it. And each of them has their own perspective based on the small slice that they worked on. So I'll make my own modest attempt to answer these questions today and share a few thoughts that I have about them. We've certainly learned many new facts about Joseph Smith's life. New documents have given us new vistas on early Latter-day Saint history. And I'll mention a few of those during the course of my remarks. At the same time, much of the value of the papers comes not in the form of startling new discoveries. What we learn from the project most often confirms what we already understood in part, or allows us to speak with greater confidence, clarity, and authority than we could before about the prophet's life. I'd argue that this is one of the most important legacies of the papers. I'm trying to advance my slide, but it's not succeeding. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So, how many of you recognize the subject of this photograph? Hopefully everybody, okay? Examining and contextualizing Joseph Smith's papers closely over the years has done something like this. Now, I don't want to exaggerate or say that we now know everything there is to know about Joseph Smith or have a perfect picture of his life. Far from it. But as with this photo, we can now see the beloved subject of our picture so much more clearly, as if we've put on corrective lenses after so many years of squinting. The papers clarify the surrounding landscape, they help us take in the nuances, and they show us how the smallest details contribute to the whole. One example that stands out in my mind is the last volume of the Documents series, which was released just last summer, and it chronicles the final 6 weeks of Joseph Smith's life. It's not the individual documents in this volume that stand out so much as the way that the incessant stream of setbacks, threats, lawsuits, and frankly missteps cause the pressure on Joseph to build and build and build. You almost have to read through it blow by blow or document by document and let the effect of it all just wash over you. Getting inside of Joseph's headspace during those tumultuous months by means of an extremely detailed documentary record that was kept, sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 documents every day. It makes the Nauvoo Municipal Court's use of the city charter's expansive habeas corpus provision to shield Joseph Smith from arrest look less like a power grab and more like an act of desperation. Again, we knew the pressure was on Joseph, but the dozens of letters, pleas, mayor's orders, military orders, warrants, and affidavits open wide a window on Joseph's interior world in the final weeks leading up to his murder. Much of what we have learned comes from never before published sources, and I want to highlight a few of those for you. With the gracious support and encouragement of the First Presidency, we published a number of previously unavailable records. Notable among these was a record called the Book of Commandments and Revelations. And this precious record served as the manuscript source for the publication of Joseph Smith's revelations in the Book of Commandments and in the Doctrine and Covenants. It contains the earliest extant texts of many of Joseph's revelations, and in some cases, it contains the only surviving manuscript copy that we have. It also contains unpublished revelations, some of which were basically unknown. There's a revelation commanding Joseph Smith to seek copyright for the Book of Mormon in Canada. There's a sample of pure language, which was known previously only in part through a mention by Orson Pratt. And I'll talk a little bit later about what this manuscript revelation book and other early records teach us about Joseph Smith's revelations. But I want to highlight right now another new record that came to light through the Joseph Smith papers, and that's the Council of 50 Minutes. For so many years, there was a mystique that surrounded these minutes. What did they contain? Why had they not been published? Many suppose that the minutes harbored some explosive or embarrassing information about Joseph Smith or about Brigham Young. Not so. The minutes do reveal the intense frustration, even anger, experienced by Latter-day Saint leaders in Nauvoo toward state and federal governments. They detail both Joseph's efforts to work within existing legal and political frameworks to improve the saints' situation, as well as his willingness to imagine a new theocratic constitution and explore places outside the sway of the U.S. government for them to carry out the commandment to build Zion. Oh, it looks like I don't have the most updated. I had this really cool slide I added earlier, and it was a Lord of the Rings meme. And I feel bad you're all missing out. But for those of you who have seen The Lord of the Rings, imagine Elrond telling Isildur to cast the ring into the fire and to destroy it. So, mental picture. William Clayton, who was the person who kept the minutes of the Council of 50, was directed to destroy those minutes, perhaps because they would appear treasonous. But he chose instead to bury them, and later he retrieved them and brought them to Utah. And this is one of those instances in which, as historians, we're grateful that Clayton chose to disregard the counsel of his leaders. So, in the council's meetings, Joseph Smith shared teachings that ought to become classics, like these statements on the working of councils. He said, "The reason why men always failed to establish important measures was because in their organization, they never could agree to disagree long enough to select the pure gold from the dross by the process of investigation." On another occasion, he declared that he wanted all the brethren to speak their minds, to say what was in their hearts, whether good or bad. He did not want to be forever surrounded by a set of doughheads. And if they didn't rise up and shake themselves and exercise themselves in discussing these important matters, he should consider them nothing better than doughheads. This may be a little harsh, but it's designed to provoke them and us to engage in the process of counseling together. So, what have the papers taught us about revelation in Scripture? In many respects, the volumes of the Revelations and Translation series of the Joseph Smith Papers are the crown jewels of the project. Together with the detailed historical context provided for each of Joseph's revelations in the volumes of the document series, they provide a critical baseline for understanding the Restoration canon. Through Joseph Smith's papers and the careful reconstructive work done by the project's historians, for example, we learn more about the context in which the revelations were given. We learn the questions that William McClellan asked the Lord that were answered in section 65 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We learn that Sidney Rigdon and Lehman Copley left eagerly to share the revelation to the Shakers on the very day that it was given. We learned that other Christian reformers had established a temperance society in Kirtland, Ohio at the time that the word of wisdom was given. We learn more about the financial challenges the saints faced in the mid-1830s as they tried to fund the construction of cities and temples through a banking institution and other efforts. And then we learn how all of this served as a backdrop for the revelations on tithing given in Far West in 1838. We learn in greater detail how Joseph's translation of the Bible prompted new understandings of priesthood and church ecclesiastical structure. And these are just a few examples. But what's the big takeaway? What do these contextual clues tell us about the Latter-day Saint concept of revelation? Well, we see its dialogic nature. We see how it comes in response to questions. So many questions. Joseph's queries arose from his circumstances, from his culture, from his study of Scripture, from his own spiritual yearnings. And the revelations that were given in response did not come in a vacuum. Most of them weren't divorced from the churn and turbulence of life in the world. Rather, they were designed to both help the saints navigate the ever-changing culture in which they lived and cheer them along the way with glimpses of a glorious rest. The papers also open a window on the here a little, there a little nature of revelation as experienced by the prophet. Examples include section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This section, known as the Church's Constitution, appears to us in our scriptures today as a flat text. That's how we experience it. And it gives the impression that it was received and dictated whole. But using the Joseph Smith Papers, we can trace its textual history to see that it was not only painstakingly edited for publication, but substantively amended by further revelation. We think that the earliest extant text of section 20 was a surreptitious copy made and then published in the Painesville Telegraph. It lacks, this copy of the section lacks the texts of the baptismal and sacrament prayers. That we, like that's why most of us refer to section 20 all the time. It's like, what's the sacrament prayer? Okay, it's not there. It simply refers instead to relevant passages in the Book of Mormon. By the time the Revelation was copied into the Book of Commandments and Revelations months later, Joseph had not only added relevant excerpts from the Book of Mormon, but clarified other details in the revelation, including how frequently, for example, the church's elders were to meet in conference. Joseph's contemporaries seemed to understand that the revelation was still in a state of becoming. In one early copy, they labeled it, "Thus far the church articles and covenants." Thus far. Well, we could walk through a similar analysis of section 27, section 107, and others. These revelations came in pieces. We're reminded of the verse in 2 Nephi about how the Lord giveth more to those who hearken to his earlier counsel, dispensing revelation line upon line according to the understanding of its recipients. Many of the insights about Scripture that arose from the research of the project team were incorporated into the 2013 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And these changes include expansions and refinements to the introduction of the book, a few spelling changes in the text itself, and then revised headings for 57 sections that correct dates and locations for the revelations and then improve their content relating to the circumstances in which the revelations were given. And this is one of the most visible and lasting legacies of the papers, at least as I see it. What have we learned about the way that Joseph Smith's experiences shaped him? There is a lot that you could say on this topic, and I have time to basically give one example. But the papers reveal the depth to which Joseph's views later in life were shaped by the crucible of persecution. He and his family and his faith community suffered so acutely as a religious and a cultural minority in a political and social climate that was frequently hostile to the saints' aims, that Joseph became deeply attuned to the need to protect the rights of marginalized people, especially their right to worship how, where, and what they may. Joseph developed an almost reflexive distaste for the way people in power trampled on religious freedom. His teachings on this topic from the Council of 50 Minutes help us understand what Joseph hoped a new constitution or a more just government would look like. He said, God cannot save or damn a man only on the principle that every man acts, chooses, and worships for himself. Hence the importance of thrusting from us every spirit of bigotry and intolerance toward a man's religious sentiments. I will appeal to every man in this council, beginning at the youngest, that when he arrives at the years of a hoary age, he will have to say that the principles of intolerance and bigotry never had a place in this kingdom nor in my breast. When I have used every means in my power to exalt a man's mind and have taught him righteous principles to no effect, and he's still inclined in his darkness, yet the same principles of liberty and charity would ever be manifested by me as though he had embraced it. A man should be judged by the law independent of his religious prejudice. And religious freedom had to be for everyone, not just people who believed the way Joseph did. This was more than rhetoric for the prophet. We know that he put his money where his mouth is. For example, when he learned that a Catholic priest from Iowa wanted to administer last rites to a dying parishioner, but lacked the means to cross the river and make the trip, Joseph paid his passage on a ferry and loaned him a horse. What have we learned about Joseph's character from his papers? Well, here we learn, but we mostly relearn things that we knew. We relearn from the papers that Joseph was quick to forgive, that he was generous with his time and means, that he was prone to see the best in people, which often meant that he felt the sting of betrayal, that he cared deeply for the plight of the poor, that he turned to God in almost every aspect of his life. Again, the cumulative effect of the thousands of small details in the papers is the project's most important contribution to our understanding of Joseph's character. One accusation that has dogged Joseph going back almost to his boyhood was that he was a deceiver or a charlatan. And it's extremely difficult to maintain this assessment in the face of thousands of documents, public and private, that portray an earnest believer in the revelations that he received. He shaped his life around them, he risked financial ruin to carry them out, and he died defending them. One of my colleagues put it this way: what emerges from the papers is a Joseph Smith who ardently believes his own revelations. It is a Joseph Smith who is less jocular and unserious than we might have supposed. His serious business is to live and die by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The idea of Joseph Smith as a conscious deceiver falls apart under the collective weight of the papers. At the same time, we learn from the papers more clearly than ever just how human Joseph was. He was somewhat hapless as a businessman. I'm trying to be generous. His ideas about race and gender roles were deeply informed by his surrounding culture. He had a temper. He sometimes engaged in violent altercations with people he believed had wronged him. It's easy to get the impression from a few of Joseph's sermons that he had an overinflated sense of self and that he was given to braggadocio. And indeed, he had his moments. He once said, "I have more to boast of than ever any man had. I'm the only man that's been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. The followers of Jesus ran away from him, but the Latter-day Saints never ran away from me yet." But we can read these rhetorical flourishes in a different light or as carrying a different tone when we place it in the context, first of all, of the sometimes hyperbolic preaching culture of the day, or certainly in the context of Joseph's own willingness to publish revelations in which God chastised him for his failings, or even in the context of statements of new converts and non-Latter-day Saints who found Joseph's lack of pretension striking enough to comment on it frequently. For example, one person said he does not pretend to be a man without failings and follies, neither is he puffed up with his greatness, as many suppose, but on the contrary is familiar with any decent man. Or, I found Joseph familiar in conversation, easy and unassuming. Or, and this one's from his non-Latter-day Saint attorney, he was very courteous in discussion and would not oppose you abruptly, but had due deference to your feelings. One instance in which Joseph's self-awareness shines through was the only time he was unambiguously convicted of a criminal offense. This happened in 1843. He had visited a city lot in Nauvoo that he believed had been unfairly seized by a county tax collector. The discussion between Joseph and the tax official escalated from verbal argument to a physical confrontation, and Joseph got the better of his rival. Now, immediately afterward, Joseph voluntarily submitted to a local justice of the peace, confessed his guilt, and insisted on paying a fine for his actions. Well, there's a lot more that we could say. Dr. Laurie Maffley Kipp noted at a recent conference that one of the significant contributions of the Joseph Smith papers has little to do with Joseph himself, but rather the way that it illuminates the lives of those around him. While the Papers Project, she said, centers on the lifespan of Joseph Smith, the portrait it paints is of an entire community at work. It brings to life the everyday labors of many of the early saints, naming many whose names would otherwise not make it into synthetic histories. Indeed, we have made an effort to highlight the contributions of the thousands of men and women whose faith in the revelations profoundly shaped the history of the church, but who are little known. I think of the efforts of one of our team members, Elizabeth Keene, to understand the material culture and day-to-day life of those who lived in frontier communities using details found in Joseph Smith's financial records. Or the work that Brent Rogers has done to flesh out the biography of Vienna Jakes. The papers have theological and devotional implications as well. In them we learn more about the development of church organization, about priesthood, about the saints' efforts to build a Zion community, and about the origins of our temple doctrine. But I want to close by reflecting on what we've learned about our efforts as a church history department, to keep and share a record of church history. The project has taught us that our history can withstand the most intense scrutiny. By deciding to be fully transparent about Joseph Smith's life, we hoped, in Richard Bushman's words, that there were no rocks we would turn over and find a scorpion. The church said, in essence, we're going to turn over all the rocks. And as Richard quipped, it proved a marvelous gamble. We have learned or relearned that a habit of historical transparency strengthens trust in the church. We have learned or relearned that faithful people can produce rigorous scholarship and have their faith strengthened in the process. We have learned and relearned that aspects of church history are challenging for many Latter-day Saints to reconcile, and that we need to give our best efforts to minister to them, particularly those with sincere questions about church history. In addition to learning from news sources, I'm sorry. In addition to learning from news sources, in the course of the project, we can learn from the paper's consistent application of rigorous standards of analysis. This has spiritual consequences in today's world. One of the challenges of the digital age is a sustained assault on truth. As the internet has democratized publishing, it's become more difficult than ever to sift through the many voices and arrive at reliable conclusions about even simple matters. Latter-day Saints are vulnerable to distortion and exaggeration about aspects of our history, even from well-meaning people. And this puts at risk our ability to engage in the kind of sacred remembering that we've been encouraged to do. The Papers tries to model what a reliable source of historical information looks like. It considers all the sources, it assesses their creative motives carefully, it weighs them against each other, it places them in context, and it is measured in its conclusions. This approach to history is not the least important thing that we can learn from the Papers. Former church historian Stephen E. Snow was fond of calling the Joseph Smith Papers the Church History Department's lunar mission. Just as NASA's lunar program yielded technological advancements far beyond the original intent and scope of the program, the Joseph Smith Papers project has done more than illuminate the life of the founding prophet. It has helped change the way that we do history. Most saints won't read the volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers, but we work hard to make insights from the papers as widely accessible as we can. We're currently working on a revised and updated compilation of Joseph Smith's teachings. It will distill many of the most important sources from the papers, present them in an easy-to-read edition, and ensure that they're widely translated. And as President Oakes announced at our Joseph Smith Papers Conference last summer, the First Presidency has commissioned a new biography of Joseph Smith to be authored by Richard Turley Jr. Our Joseph Smith Papers team is excited to be involved in supporting that effort and thus to continue to build on the foundation of the papers. And you can see here other examples of the kinds of projects that we have produced that build on the work that was done by the Joseph Smith Papers team. In the end, we hope that our efforts will not only help millions to know Brother Joseph again in the sense that we will maybe be able to reach more people than ever through products such as these, but because we now have the resources to know him more completely. Thank you.
He said he'd be happy to take some questions, and so we can either take them from the floor, or I could do it with Huva. Should we just take it from the floor? Anybody have any questions? Yes. So make sure you repeat the question they ask. So.
Yeah. So the question is, how was the Papers Project funded and why? And why was it funded in that way? It's a straightforward question with a somewhat complicated answer, but I'll try to keep it fairly simple. The Larry H. Miller family were a key funder of the Joseph Smith Papers. But it's not true to say that the church did not fund the papers. It was funded jointly by the church and by the Miller family, and has been for quite some time since the papers moved from BYU up to the Church History Department more than a decade and a half ago. And part of the reason that it was funded in this way is just that Larry H. Miller had a vision for this project. He was aware of the work that Dean Jesse had done in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to recover and to publish Joseph Smith's papers in various publications. Was eager to see that continue. He said he felt prompted by the Lord to come forward with an offering of support. And so we are very, very much indebted to Larry and to Gail and their family for a tremendous amount of support that they provided the project for many, many years. And I think that's the short version of the story. Hopefully that's helpful. Yeah.
I was able to remember when Ron Esper came and talked about the rolling out of this project.
Mm-hmm.
How's he doing?
How's Ron doing? He's hanging in there. He's doing okay. Ron, I apologize, I didn't repeat the question. It's a question about Ron Esplin, who is one of the key early members of the project team and kind of a driving spirit of the project for many years. And Ron he's doing okay. We still talk to him. He's spending a lot of his time working and focusing on scholarship relating to Brigham Young through the Brigham Young Center. You may have noticed that the first volume of the Brigham Young papers, one of the volumes with some of his journals, was published, I think, last year. And that effort is an effort that Ron oversees with the support of scholars, some of whom are on our Joseph Smith Papers team, and some of whom come from other institutions or backgrounds. I think right here, yeah.
What's the future for JSD? Is it going to be disbanded, or are there other projects that it's going to be working on?
Great question. What's the future? What is it? In part for the project and perhaps in part for the team, it sounds like that we've assembled to work on it. As I suggested in my remarks, many members of the team are working on building a layer of scholarship that grows out of the foundation of the papers right now. Scholarship that we think and hope will be helpful to Rick Turley as he works on his biography. And so there's some discussions with Rick, but we had the team, many members of the team are busily engaged just continuing to figure out what does it look like to build on that foundation. When we released the final volume of the project, our advisors, Elder Bednar and Elder Gong, and I think the first time I heard this might have been at the press event. They said, "This is chapter 1. You ain't seen nothing yet." And then I thought, oh my goodness, what is chapter 2? That's something we're working on and that we're thinking about right now. Aside from further work on Joseph Smith's life, though, our team is engaged working on other approved projects within the Church History Department and will continue to publish, we think, important works of historical scholarship going forward. And 2 of them that will come out next year. One of them is the first. Well, I don't want to say it's the first, but it's a rather unique history that tells the story of the Young Women's Organization within the church. It's a really remarkable work of scholarship by some of our women's history specialists. And then, as Elder Snow announced several years ago, we're working on preparing the William Clayton Journals from Nauvoo for publication, and our hope is that will appear next year as well. So, and then there are other things down the road, but we're busy. And
I know there's clearly some difference between the way the church is handling history now versus the way they have in the past. Mm-hmm. But can you kind of shine a light perhaps on what difference there might be from, say, Arrington's team in the 70s and what you guys have been doing in the last 20 years? You know, is it more than just professionalism? Is it the size of the team? Obviously, record access and things like that. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, you did they can hear the questions now. Okay, good. It's a great question. I think you captured some of the really important things that I might have shared. It's certainly about the size of the investment in staff and in historical expertise that I think we owe in part to Larry and Gail and to their efforts to say, you know, what can we do to help this particular project go forward. And then, the historical profession has changed a lot since the 1960s and 70s, and so just as the 1960s and 70s were so different from the early 20th century. I mean, the kinds of questions that you ask, the kinds of sources that you interrogate, the approaches that you take are different. And so I think we've got like a really, really spectacular, well-trained, but somewhat younger team in terms of their training and their approach than perhaps what Leonard and his team might have taken. And then, yeah, I think just an increasing willingness and amount of support and encouragement from church leaders, and sometimes that takes the form of expanded access to records, as you suggested, and then in other instances, just our ability to, particularly with the Joseph Smith papers, just examine everything and do a fully open publication. I think that's I think there are a number of things that I would point to as differences. But what Leonard and his team did, I mean, incredible, important foundation, and all of us consider our work to be building on what he did. So where's the mic headed next? Right in the back, okay.
How has this influenced thoughts of future prophets or their paper, the Russell M. Nelson papers or what? Like, has it influenced how a record is kept for future generations, or informing them on how they might better keep a record? I'm curious about that.
This is a good question. You touched a little nerve there. If we had archivists here, they would have been twitching. It's actually something that we are worried about all of the time, right? What does the record look like? And the records are kept differently, if you haven't noticed, in the world that we live in here in the 21st century than they were in the past. And we often wonder what that would look like, and we spend a fair amount of time thinking about and working with, as a department, working with other church departments, with church leaders at various levels, to make sure that there is a records plan in place that is going to be adequate for the needs of the future. And I maybe implicit in your question is, well, what about the papers of other presidents? I think I pointed out that the Brigham Young Center is doing a fantastic job of working their way through the Brigham Young papers right now. That's a project that we did not decide to take on, and they're brave souls. The Wilford Woodruff Foundation has done a phenomenal job with the Wilford Woodruff papers, and they're working on, as you may know, an open and accessible publication of his papers, which we're very excited about and have enjoyed watching, and that we use in our work as historians in the department. And so in some ways those are another kind of outgrowth or legacy of the papers that we were kind of on the sidelines as cheerleaders there, but we're invested in and excited about. Yes. Oh, wait, who has the mic next? I don't know. I'm sorry. Is it back here? Okay.
You said Joseph Smith scuffed up a tax collector. Did he have it coming?
I don't know. I mean, that's a tough question to answer. Joseph certainly thought he did, but if you judging from the way Joseph behaved in the wake of that incident, it appears that he thought better of it and decided that whether he had it coming or not, Joseph needed to maybe not respond quite the way he did. So submitted to due process. I'm not sure where the mic is. Is it here? Oh. Do you want me to call on someone first?
Yeah.
You can go to whoever's closest. We've got a few more minutes.
You mentioned two coming publications. I'm curious, the biography you mentioned from Turley, as well as the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. What kind of time frame do you think for both of those? Any idea?
Years.
Many years. Okay.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know about many.
Way. Okay.
I don't know about many, but
But it's not set at
But
all.
it's not coming. It's not coming in a matter of months. So, I mean, I'm hoping the teachings volume could be done in the next couple of years. And then I feel bad for this side. I haven't called on enough people over here. Maybe right this hand here.
Thank you. Was there a particularly inspiring or memorable moment for you when working on the project?
Yeah, I shared part of this. Okay, so let me help you understand really the involvement of all of our historians. But we work through and are assigned specific documents to work on, and I have this bizarrely deep expertise in a handful of documents that, but this is like just such a drop in the pond compared to all of the material that's there. But one of the things that I've enjoyed over the past about 5 years has been my role as a reviewer of the work of my colleagues. And I tried to get at this a little bit in my remarks, but for me, one of the most powerful experiences I had was just reading the last volume of the document series, and having moments where I felt like, I mean, I know that my life can be stressful at times, but just trying to get myself in Joseph's imaginary and try to understand what it was like for him during the final weeks of his life. And it reduced me to tears on more than one occasion, because it's just overwhelming. And then the other thing I would point to, just trying to, off the top of my head here, is the experience of being able to pick up the volume that contains the facsimiles of the pages of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. And you know, it's one thing, what we tried to do with that volume is to make the experience that you have with that volume better than the experience that someone might have holding the pages themselves. In part because the pages themselves have deteriorated over time, the text is not very legible on them, and we went to great lengths with multispectral imaging and other efforts to make the pages of that book just really represent that document and that artifact in an incredible way. And so to have the book in my hand and to open it up, open those pages and look at them, and to know that I'm having an experience with an artifact that was in the room as Joseph Smith dictated the text of the Book of Mormon, and as Oliver Cowdery wrote it down, was moving. It was moving to me, and I you know, if there's one I'm not trying to sell books here, but if there is one volume in the entire papers that I think you might want to go try to invest in, that's that book, for those very reasons, just because it's maybe the kind of one of the closest experiences you can have with what most of us here would consider like a very sacred artifact. Oh, see, I told you I wasn't a very good salesman. It's volume 5 of the Revelations and Translations series. And the one story I can share about it maybe is that we took a copy over to deliver it to the First Presidency, and they picked it up and noticed how heavy it was, and from what I understand, went around the church administration building to see if there was a scale to find out. And we didn't know how much it weighed until they weighed it for us, and it was heavy. I don't remember, but it's a hefty book, but it's really incredible. Yeah, let's see. So maybe here with the.
For the average church member who doesn't do anything more than listen to General Conference and attend Sunday school, how will the Joseph Smith papers affect their understanding of the church and the gospel?
Yeah, and my thought on that is that, and I tried to point at a few of these things, but it influences their study of the scriptures because of the work we've been able to do to improve the study aids around the Doctrine and Covenants. That seems like an important thing that's going to reach a large audience of church members. I think that the insights that we've learned from the papers could come to Latter-day Saints through the form of just even some of these products here, some of which are, have been read by millions of people. And they're deeply informed by the scholarship that was done for the papers. So we're conscious that the papers are a scholarly product and designed for a particular audience, but have gone, we hope, to great lengths to try to make sure that we distill the insights from it and then present it and make it available in a repackaged form in a way that will benefit a much wider audience of church members. Maybe one more question. Is this over here okay?
At what time did the general authorities decide to open up the archives of the church? And was there any particular event and the philosophy that brought that about?
Well, that might be above my pay grade. I think there's probably not a very straightforward answer to the when question, because I think there's been an ebb and a flow that's gone on for decades and decades and decades. I do think that the papers themselves do represent an important inflection point in that story. And so the beginning of the work on the papers, the way that the team was able to work through interesting and challenging material and publish it and do it in a way that earned the respect of scholars and was important. And so the work on the early volumes of the papers then ended up having a snowballing effect. And so as we went along, there were other key moments in that process over the course of 22 some odd years where further records and materials were made available. So there's not maybe one moment, but it's been a long story and one that continues. Well, thank you for your questions. It's been good to be here with you. I appreciate it.